Welcome to the Thinking Expansively seminar series. Known as TESS Talks, this series offers ways of thinking beyond normative sites and forms of knowledge by starting from elsewhere in a way that unsettles and reconfigures knowledge. Thinking expansively redefines how we approach knowledge, pushing us to imagine and realize a more equitable and inhabitable world. Today, our speaker is Dr. Omolola Olarinde from Elizade University, Nigeria. Omolola holds a PhD in economics from Ibadan University. She is a university-based researcher working on intersections of labor, migration, gender, governance, inclusive growth, and decoloniality. Her talk today is based on her paper in the journal Gender, Place and Culture, entitled African Women Migration Researchers and the Question of Reflexivity.
So it's myself and my colleague from the Open University, Parvati Raghuram, who's instrumental in writing the paper. You will find out as I present. And two other colleagues from Africa, Delalu Badasu from the University of Ghana and Goreti Yogo from the African Migration and Development Policy Center in Kenya. So thank you once more. I'm going to start off by telling you how we approached reflexivity and what adopting a reflexive research process entailed for us. Just so that we have some definitional background, that we thought about this as a critical scrutiny that was continuous and that involved interpretation and reinterpretation of phenomena that we had already encountered severally, but that we were rethinking in the context of reflexivity. And we thought about it a lot like a method, rather than it's been dealt with as a theoretical concept or in other ways, but we thought about it a lot like a method, but also as some form of quality control to look at our data and to look at ourselves, and in that context to interpret our work. And what we think is very important is that we think that once we were able to do that and acknowledge our biases and the positionalities with which we came to the research and the complexities that resulted from that, it enhanced the final work. It enhanced not only that particular report that we were able to make, but also the way going forward we're able to look at research through this reflexivity lens. And it was particularly important for me because at the time that I wrote this paper, which was in 2023, it was my first encounter with reflexivity. There are many ways in which scholars have used reflexivity, but for us particularly, we thought about the topic of our research. It was our project, the Migration for Inclusive African Growth Project, was about looking at immigrants to African countries from global north. So we looked at UK, for example, from what we called global south, but what was mostly Asia. So we looked at Lebanon and India and China. And from what we called regional migration, so from other African countries within the regional economic communities. For us, it was ECOWAS. For the Kenyan group, it was the East African community. So we looked at it in the sense of our own topic, which was looking at the contributions of immigrants to the destination country. And we also looked at the various categories that we were exploring, particularly for the reflexivity work. We were concerned with our positionality as women researching migration. So that was an important category for us. And it was also an important category because we were concerned about the variations in challenges to work, because we were discussing how we were able to collaborate in a project that was across various cultures and how that mattered. And then we looked at it as a methodology and how it would affect migration research in practice. I'll talk a little more about this later. So the paper itself set out to explain to new initiates of reflexivity, which we were at that time. It explained to, well, not all of us, I'll explain better, but I was, as the lead author. Parvati wasn't. She had already been familiar, and she was trying to nudge us in certain directions to be more reflexive. But I was at the time, and so we were documenting those practical steps and the key considerations we had to adopt in order to successfully complete the reflexive process that led us to the publication of the paper. We also looked at insights by doing not only self-reflection through reflecting on our positionalities, but a textual reflection, going back to look at our field notes and our research notes to look at the insights that we could generate from our project if we could interpret the findings in a different way, looking at it from a reflexivity lens. And we also looked at it as a collaborative practice. So if we thought reflexively about ourselves, in my case, Global South scholar, in Parvati's case, she identified as a post-colonial Global North scholar, how those positionalities affect the collaborative practice of this reflexive project. And it was across continents, essentially Europe, from where Parvati identified as, and Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya were the three countries on the African side. For me, the idea was new. I had just concluded a PhD at the time that we were writing. I concluded that in 2021. And we were asked then to have a particular section where we thought about our contribution to knowledge. So it was sort of a knowledge creation perspective. But there was no mention of the word reflexivity. And it was what was being introduced to me was new. We had understood that we should start to occupy better positions in the knowledge creation space, but not through this reflective practice. It was also a huge contrast, and it was very challenging for us because training, particularly in economics, but also in the other disciplines, geography, for instance, the trainings that we had, for instance, my partner, our co-author, Delali, from University of Ghana, is in the field of, she's a trained geographer, and she, for us, we had different methodologies, and it was very difficult for us, based on our initial training, to adopt this position of non-bias and subjectiveness, non-objectiveness. But it was also very, it was a happy space for us because we understood that it was a space for us to become original, to adopt some new languages and methodologies that allowed us to express our original thoughts. Once we started doing reflexivity, it was about re-examining the frames that we had been boxed in by our fields, and particularly theoretical frameworks that had a Western dominance in terms of where the knowledge originated from. In economics, there's quite a bit of Nigerian and African theoretical framing since the 70s, but it's certainly a very small bit compared to what the Western theories are, the volume of Western theories. So we had to question those frames. And we had previously been able to do this by thinking of ourselves as local custodians of knowledge who knew the local environment, and changing variables in a model for economics if those variables did not reflect local conditions. But for us, but doing this reflexively was a lot more than just questioning assumptions. It was about adding the part of positionalities. And so we were moving past just looking at global frames and how we could add local variables to capture the national variations, and recognizing that there were unique privileges that our positionality offered us that were affecting the way that we approach research. And interestingly, this came, the intersectional part came after we got our reviewer comment, and it was insisted that we had to look at this part of reflexivity, after which we found it extremely useful to acknowledge that there were power relations and there were variations, and there were, as intersectional theory suggests, gender and race was important in looking at how these shape the researcher roles. And so we found that very important as well. Theoretically, I think in the broader sense, we situated our work within constructivism. For economists, that would mean something that we call rational expectations theory, where we think that people would anticipate a particular outcome and then act in response to their expectations rather than the actuality. But that's type of constructivism limited us, because now it was beyond expectations that were generated from expectations that we had, but also how your positionality, how your income category, how who you were, where you were from, the gender that you were influenced these expectations. And that intersection did not exist in economies. So I would say that we, and that's another advantage of interdisciplinary research, I would say that we situated our work within Bordeaux's idea of constructivism rather than a particular economist or other kind of idea of what this meant. And then also at the time we were reviewing the paper, it was we had this thought about how much that was contributing to the decolonialization of knowledge, and how we saw ourselves. So because the three of us African researchers in the group were already at the time of the research involved in policy making in our countries and advising key policymakers, we were no longer disempowered researchers, as Mwabari says, but we were seeing ourselves as brokers of knowledge beyond just being custodians of local knowledge. But we were starting to think about what that meant in contributing to the knowledge creation space. But we are also very careful, as Raghuram and Sundhi had said in the book, that we needed not to start from a position of coloniality, rather than thinking about ourselves as colonized people who were escaping a colonization. We were thinking of ourselves as people who were brokers of knowledge in our own spaces. And I think that that was an important way that we thought about this decoloniality concept. And as I said earlier with Rodriguez's work on reflexivity, we were thinking about the layered positionalities and how they intersected with our findings. So we started to think more deeply about what exactly it meant for us. The idea that knowledge is influenced by the knower, and that there's a process, a co-creation of knowledge between the researcher, the participant, and even researchers in a common project, as the case was with us. We were also thinking about the fact that, particularly because we had embarked on the reflexivity, the way we call it ex post, at the end of the project, which is not, I mean, many reflexive papers start off as a reflexive exercise rather than as an afterthought or a quality control method, the way we used it. And so it was very important for us to consider this unreflexive knowledge and practices that we had, with which we had embarked on our project initially, vis-a-vis what we thought we should be doing at the stage of reflexivity. And I'll explain that step by step when I get to methodological sections. And as Bordeaux says, you can have reflexivity in an epistemological, methodological, or ethical stance. And we thought about these in all these three ways. Starting with recognizing our positionality as the first step in reflexivity, as Carlin says. So we played with a number of methods, and knowing that our work was collaborative, it required more than just an orthoethnography, but also us thinking about our histories, our life histories in relation to one another. In a collaborative work like ours, we adopted this dual ethnography. As I mentioned earlier, we had already completed the field work and were already well into the analysis when we were introduced and were thinking about starting this reflexive practice. So we thought about it ex post in terms of the timing of our own reflection. And one thing that was a challenge for us at the start was, thinking about reflexivity as some sort of confessional discourse in which you're wondering whether you have not done something correctly in the work or whether you need to critique yourself and then confess problems. We were very careful, having looked at what Berger and Macbeth had to say about this, and I think it's very important not to be narcissistic or confessional in the way that we engage with reflexivity, but to be immersive and to reintroduce ourselves into the process and try to reevaluate what we thought over and over again through many iterations, which I will explain shortly. Our process of doing this dual ethnography involved us engaging in intensive dialogue. So we had a set of questions, and the way we've done this dual ethnography was sort of longitudinal over an extended period of time. And we talked about our background, we talked about our experiences, we talked about lighter things like family obligations, and those came out at times when, for example, delay was something that gave us a chance to really reflect on what it meant to do scholarship with Global North scholars. So often when we weren't meeting timelines, we had that chance to speak about what we thought was causing the delay. And as everyone was seen as responsible researchers with a sense of integrity, it became a very important aspect that people had actually done all their best to meet with the deadlines that we had set for ourselves, but something was in place. And that helped us in being able to discuss what being women African researchers meant. I'll present that in the findings side. And then we used the language of I and we. And so when we said I, it essentially meant individual experiences. But when those individual experiences converged, we talked about them as collective autobiographical experiences, and we talked about we. But also the fact that we had certain commonalities influenced whether those individual experiences converged or not. And again, the dual ethnography allowed us to explore ourselves and our projects using dimensions through which we affected our project and our project affected us. Somewhere around when we were thinking about how we did the interviews, we started to question the extent to which we were insiders or outsiders. As I mentioned, the way the project was designed, we were supposed to, the African scholars were collecting data and sharing that data with the rest of the team, which was essentially in the UK. And we were then jointly analyzing the data. Now, the research instrument was collaboratively developed, so it was quite inclusive at that process. But it was a little different from, for example, the current project I'm on, where data is collected at many spots. So there are Africans collecting data. But for example, in the dynamic study, which I'm referring to now, where we look at migration decision-making, what we've done is some people are collecting data in their country of origin, like I am in Nigeria. Some others are collecting in other African countries, but not about their own population. So, for example, my colleagues in Morocco were collecting data about Nigerians in Morocco. And similarly, my colleagues in Kenya did collect data about Nigerians in Kenya. And then my colleagues in the UK were also collecting data about Nigerians in the UK. Now that's a very interesting dynamic about where we can really explore insider, outsider, and in-betweener. But the particular project I'm explaining now, which is the MAIC project, involved us who were nationals collecting data and sharing that data, deciding collectively the research methodology, but then continuing to analyze those data with Global North partners who were involved in the project. Now, initially, we had thought of ourselves as gateways, gatekeepers, people who can give them access to the research community. However, in the sense of our project where we're studying immigrants, we were not really that much of insiders because we were studying people who lived in our country but who were not of origin from our country. And especially since we were studying first generation immigrants and not second or third generation, it was even more glaring that we were neither insiders nor outsiders. But more than that, Delali, who was with the University of Ghana, was reporting at some point because we had a part of our sample population were policymakers in our countries. And when she was to interview policymakers, she was going to be asking one of her former students for an interview position. And now she was an insider into migration, but she wasn't an insider into that particular position that the policymaker had. So we started to think about the complexities about being insider and outsider, but also about what it meant to know about the local community contextually, but what it also meant vis-a-vis other people who had maybe not a first-hand knowledge like our Global South partners, but had a theoretical framing for how to look at those local conditions. So we saw that we moved between insider, outsider, and in-betweener in our positions on the project. And as I mentioned earlier, there were 3 African scholars, 1 global, not post-colonial scholar. In terms of our background, we were all middle class, all highly educated. 3 out of 4 had a PhD. We were research-based social scientists, although a couple of us were in the university, but most of us were engaged in research. So we considered ourselves university-based researchers, for example, and we were women. And because we all worked on the same thematic, migration and gender, we thought that those were points where we understood common terminology, but we still had differences in background. We had a mix of 1 early career, 1 mid-career, and 2 advanced career level scholars. We had a mix of disciplines, mostly geography, economics, and then mostly geography and economics. And then we had variations in experience with reflexivity. As I said, one of us had advanced experience. I was novel to it. Another of us was teaching reflexivity, but was not writing reflexively or practicing reflexively. There was a mix in racial and ethnic profiles in the sense that we were from different parts of the continent, but also from even within of the globe, but also within the same continent, we had different ethnic profiles. How did we then approach being reflexive, having this kind of complex group? First of all, we thought about how to do reflexivity, and what Parvati did was to share some documentation that she thought we needed to look at and start thinking reflectively. And that meant challenging our objective frames. Now, after reading the papers from our objective frames, we thought, oh, we're all bright and ready. We've read those papers and we're all ready for this reflexivity exercise. But during our first round of interviews, it was quite frustrating for Parvati, who was leading the questions, because she said, you're returning to your frames of objectivity and you're not doing what this entails. So we'll take these interviews and rethink again. Why don't you look at another paper? So we found that challenging, particularly thinking outside those objective frames and using the language that we were used to. We wanted to talk about evidence and validity and accuracy, and it was difficult to do away with this. And we wanted to claim that what we were writing in the paper was, had external validity, and everybody could use this. And we had to examine the constructivist literature and understand what this actually meant in the sense of reflexive studies, and re-examine to what extent what we knew, the epistemologies of it all. And so we struggled with creating, with talking outside positivist frames, with what it meant to actually question assumptions, question knowledge beyond just removing variables or questioning assumptions. And I think Gorati Yogo explains this very well when she says, I felt like a coin with two sides. And contributing to the part that is silenced as a researcher, she felt that as an unbiased social scientist, she should collect data without trying to influence the process. And then she, being put into this reflexivity position, questioned how she had been doing this all the while. Obviously, this is not to say that there's anything wrong with being an unbiased social scientist. It's just to say that we found these were the difficulties and the challenges that we found when we tried to become reflexive. But eventually we accepted the constructivist frame that we were not independent observers of the social world that we inhabited. We had two major shifts, I would say. The epistemic shift in becoming aware that what we thought we knew wasn't exactly that, and re-questioning what we thought we knew. Thinking outside measurable disciplinary frames, and this I'm particularly guilty of, and thinking outside traditional reasoning tools. But also a knowledge shift. First, the idea that, and this is what we call decoloniality, the idea that we could enter into a space where we could influence conceptual ideas based on original the originality that came from who we were and the experiences that we had. And these two shifts were very, very significant to us. What we did was to think about, since we were approaching reflexivity ex post, we started to think about how our interpretation of the findings were going to be different now that we were looking at it with a reflexive lens. So this is what we meant by reflexivity as quality control. So in this case, we approached the text itself, and we were reflexive. We were doing textual reflection of our results, although we acknowledge that there are other ways that you can think about reflexivity, particularly not approaching it ex post. And even where, after doing this exercise, even where my project does not require me to be reflexive ex ante at the start of it all, I do find that it has created a shift in me, and I do have a tendency to re-examine reflexively what I'm doing and why I'm asking certain research questions, for example. We also approached it in the sense of if we were going to use other methodologies in our fields that we were already familiar with, would we be able to get to the same insights? So we were questioning whether the practice itself was useful for us at all. And you will see from our findings that we found it very useful in getting us different results than we had interpreted at the start of our project, at the start of our analysis. But then, as I said, our positionality, we questioned it, and we interacted with the research. And where we did, where we could, through our commonalities, we achieved conversions. Where we didn't, we wrote individually. How did we do this? I'm going to take it step by step, the way it's written in the paper, but also I'm going to talk about I'll just generalize this into three broad categories. So there was an unstructured instrument, which was just a set of questions that Parvati shared with us by email initially and expected us to explore. But neither the questions nor our answers made sense to one another at the initial stage. We explored them, obviously, from our own disciplinary frames, which was not what was the intention. And so not until the first meeting that we realized that we weren't able to think reflexively yet. And we then realized that we had to do this over a longer period of time and do a mix of individual interviews and group interviews, focus group discussions. So the individual interviews, after doing a couple of group interviews, the individual interviews allowed us to allowed Parvati, who was conducting the initial round of interviews, to understand how we differed as scholars and where we were, what part of the reflexive process we were unable to do based on disciplinary frames and other frames that we had, other positionalities that we held prior to trying this reflexive exercise. And once she was able to identify those, she then handed over the rest of the interviews to me, so that I conducted also both individual interviews and group discussions, but we also wrote collaboratively. Some of the group, once we had done 6 or more interviews, we started to pull them all together in a singular document. And in that singular document, we were continually reading, making comments on other people's reflections in the group, and seeing where those resonated with us or not, and that engagement helped us to build the work further. By the time we had a full draft of what we thought was a paper with some rough sections, we then moved that to collaborative tools such as we use the Google Doc, and then we started doing collaborative writing in the sense of people going to that document and filling in spaces. We did also engage in the same literature and have reflexive meetings where we had read the same literature and were discussing them, particularly literature related to reflexivity, and also identifying what exactly we meant by our positionality. And it was initially difficult because there was the feeling of where we're going to be judged. Where we, as Macbeth said, is this a confessional thing where if we said some positions, for example, this would strike you very much when you read the section on us as African women migration researchers, where we talk about our time constraints, where we talk about what it means to be advanced in career. I'll particularly give Delali Badasu's example in the paper here, where she was one of the delays, and there were multiple delays from everybody in the team, essentially. But one of the delays came from the fact that Delali had to be at a funeral. And in the course of that funeral, she had intended to go for a day, and it ended up that she was required for multiple days. And when we were reflecting on that, she said, well, you might not understand, but as I advance in my career, I'm also advancing in social obligations. So what I thought I would be required to spend a day socially interacting with people, I was asked to stay for 3 days. And because my name is all over the place, especially because of my position as an advanced career person, that has its effects on my time. And we really thought a lot about whether we wanted to put this kind of material out, or for example, when I was speaking about power outages where I worked, and particularly my emphasis was on the fact that we had a time schedule, and the time schedule was unintentionally not gender sensitive. And so at some point I went up to someone in position of authority because they decided the time schedule, and I said, well, you need to revise this time schedule because this is a male-oriented time schedule. It assumes waking up and sleeping time of males who don't have to care for children. And the person was really surprised because he said, well, the time schedule was designed based on security concerns, has nothing to do with gender. And I said, but it does. And now I'm explaining that to you. And then there was an apology, and then there was a revision of the time schedule. And these kind of personal engagements, we were worried as to whether we were going to be judged for putting this, as to whether we look in a way, as those from the poor continent kind of way when we put out these stories. But we decided eventually that it was useful to the understanding of what doing research meant from those perspectives. So here are the steps that we outline in the paper about how to go about doing reflexivity as an early someone who's approaching this for the first time. So I said that it was very difficult for us to discuss reflectively outside of the data that we had collected. When we were approaching this, we thought that we were reanalyzing the data. And later we understood that it was about reflecting on ourselves and our positionality and how we influence the data collection process, how we influence the project, how we influence the interpretation of our results. And so, but once we were able to get ahead of that part, we then started to engage with the unstructured tool in the way that I had described before. There were a set of reflexive questions which were revised several times, and then there were facilitated group discussions and later individual group discussions that encouraged us to think reflexively. And so our first step was to understand what it meant to be reflexive, to think reflexively. But as I said to you, this really involved us challenging those comfort zones that we were already familiar with and stepping out of those comfort zones and trying something that allowed us to probe further into subjects that we were uncomfortable about, methodologies that we're uncomfortable about, not being able to say this is an absolute truth when that's what we really wanted to say with our research, for example. The second thing was thinking about what we wanted to be reflexive about. As I said earlier on, we talked about our topic, which was, at the scope of our MAIEG research. We talked about ourselves, and then we talked about re-examining our findings. But coming to this point where we knew that that was what we were going to be reflexive about was not easy. Initially, we only wanted to talk about our data because that's how we were trained to, and this was supposed to be a results paper. But later, once we realized the importance of re-examining our positionalities, then we were able to get into talking about ourselves. And later on, we were able to get into re-examining the theoretical frames from a reflexive perspective and putting our own original thoughts into that process and questioning concepts that we had taken for granted, that definitions that we had taken for granted. And third, we started asking and answering the right questions. The first set of questions we asked were really just to they didn't stimulate the kind of conversation that Parvati intended when she drafted them. And so we had to rewrite those questions once we had known the kind of reflexivity we wanted to do based on the topic, based on ourselves, and based on our findings. And once we did that, we exchanged memos among ourselves. We engaged in collaborative writing, and we thought about the disciplinary markers that we had, what we thought, the epistemological positions that we held, our own personal values, what society expected of us, our lived experiences within the MAIEG project, but beyond that as well. And then once we had the draft that we were sharing, we were seeing each other's reflections, we were calling one another on the phone and asking about a particular position. We were responding to each other's experiences. And sometimes, and I could just say that the project itself drew us closer together because of being able to relate to certain experiences. And these weren't just experiences that were common for Global South scholars. They also included the Global North scholar as well. And then we were having collaborative discussions. We had our own perspectives that were emerging from working in our African countries. And these were central for us to discuss them and to re-examine the concepts and the definitions that we were using. So we wrote, we did follow-up interviews, we found gaps, we addressed them, and also importantly, the reviewers did a great job with our work, particularly by introducing ideas of decoloniality and intersectional reflexivity. And we went back to the work over and over again until we got it to what everyone was happy with, including the journal. We're trying to make sure that this was not a confession of personal biases or failures, especially when we had to deal with issues about how we as women scholars were able to do scholarship, and to stick with being integrating our insights in a scholarly way. And finally, what were those insights? Well, we had a set of insights that came from our positionality. Before, as I mentioned earlier, before embarking on the research, we had thought that we were unbiased social scientists, collecting data and analyzing this data based on very clear frames that were designed in unbiased ways. And the first thing for us was to realize that the research objective that we had set for ourselves was reflective of our own positionality as middle income women scholars. So, for example, the project was designed to look at regular labor migrants only, and it was designed to there was a particular category of respondents, participants that we were looking at, and it was after exposed, when we looked at this reflexively, we started to think about how we came about those questions, how we came about the selection criteria for who we were going to talk to, and how we came about the sampling. Now, this is, again, here is where it's difficult, because you start to think, when you're thinking reflexively, am I criticizing my own, because we're going to publish the results in unbiased scientific scholars, unbiased scientific journals as well. And you want to think, am I saying that my sample size was biased or my research objective was biased? And this becomes difficult when you want to engage reflexively. You want to think, what exactly is going on here? That's not what we're saying. We used all the methods necessary to make sure that we had a proper participant selection. But the experience itself of thinking about our research objectives, within our research objectives, we did what we set out to do, but we were questioning how we got about those research objectives in the first place. We also had insights on whether we were insiders and outsiders. Our a priori, our initial thought was, oh yeah, we're custodians of local knowledge, and some outsiders are hiring us as insiders who know what to do to gather this knowledge and gather data about this and process it and collaboratively and come to some conclusions. And then we had to question that using the reflexive practice and realize that we were on a continuum of insider, outsider, but also importantly, and particularly given the insights that I have from my current project, the dynamic project, also importantly, the fact that you could be insider in certain aspects, the idea of researcher effect on the data collected, particularly now that we're comparing findings about the same sample, Nigerians in Nigeria, in Morocco, in the United Kingdom, in Italy. When we're doing that, we're seeing ways in which we can have a blindness to certain questions that other people who are not insiders think are important, for example, and for us, they're taken for granted. So we saw that, for example, when Delali was looking at the sample she was looking at when she was doing her policymaker surveys. But she also said that sometimes you think you're an insider and you're not at all. So she was given the instance where she was studying, it's in the paper, it's written that during her PhD thesis, she was studying a group that she thought she belonged to, but because by the time she started her study, because the group she thought she belonged to was living in an urban community, her own ethnic group, and they had intermarried, they were not really the group that she had defined herself as an insider to. So you have this continuum, particularly in migration scholarship, where people are moving a lot. And when, for example, when we had to interview people from the diaspora, so returnees, Nigerian voluntary returnees, to some extent, you're not really an insider because many of them identify as they have complex identities that they have formed from maintaining these transnational communities, and that's what we mean by insights, because obviously there's been a lot written on what insider outsider positionalities are, continuums are. We then had insights on our shared positionalities. What exactly were theoretical cultural paradigms that we had in common. Particularly, this was interesting because when we had our first draft out, we shared it with the group of researchers, so our co-researchers in the Maya group, which included researchers in the Open University in UK. And the Global North, one of the claims we made was that we had unique pressures on our time from the Global South. And it was related to the kind of workload that we had as university-based researchers, teaching loads. And one of the comments that came through from our colleagues was, well, what did you assume that I don't have those kind of workloads, or are we going to be comparing these workloads? So by dealing with those comments and speaking about what exactly these time constraints meant, we were able to understand our shared positionalities with global North scholars, so among global North and South scholars, our shared positionalities among ourselves as African scholars, but also what that meant for our research. And finally, we recognized that those positionalities that we held based on our income group, our educational category, shaped the way that we prompted questions and how we interacted. Particularly, Gority had she had a section where she spoke a lot about not being able to interview people from the informal sector like she ex-post would have preferred to do. We then had insights about ourselves, our experiences, about the example I gave earlier on gender insensitivity at work. But in when I was narrating the example, I mentioned that the schedule was made by a male-dominated group, which is professors who are members of Senate, where I am. But even though it's a male-dominated group, there's some female representation in those groups. And so we asked ourselves, for example, how about the older women in the group? And we realized, again, these intersectionalities of gender, what younger women are going through, for example, when they have to combine work and care, taking care of children, is different from what older women are going through. And sometimes after a particular age, you miss those insights. And so it allowed us to re-examine our experiences and think about us as women scholars, whether, you know, the whole question about how much marginalized we were or how much liberated we were. And it's particularly because of the reaction at the time in which I confronted the management member to say, well, your schedule doesn't work for women. The reaction was one of an apology, which essentially meant that it was a matter of not being sensitive rather than a matter of deliberately, marginalizing or enslaving. And so it's a mix of these positions that we were able to realize that we were cut in, and that it wasn't particularly an African phenomenon either. And also we were able to think about how, as I said, our position, our class, our income class, was an important variable to the challenges that we were facing, and that there are other groups that were different from us, even women groups, that where we were blind or not as sensitive. So we were going to repeat the same thing that happened to us. We were going to be insensitive to their position. And so we thought that it was very important, the intersectional part of gender and race and class. And then finally, to our research questions, the insights that we had been able to think about what frames we were using and what it was that we were supposed to study. And one of the things we found, first by ourselves, when we had an instrument, we had a research design, an instrument that we had co-developed, which clearly said that we were going to be interviewing immigrants and thinking about immigrants' contribution to the destination country. And in this case, Nigeria was considered a destination country. But it was very difficult to shift that focus because the dominant narrative is that certain countries are sending countries, Nigeria being an example, and that what's really important is the effect of emigration rather than the one of immigration. But not only, every time we did interviews, for example, with policymakers, said, oh, I can give you so many anecdotal, instances in which I think that immigrants contribute to the economy. But when we said, do you have some data that you can share with us, or have you collected anything about this? That was missing. And so we found that reflecting on that, on what our results were, we found that shifting the migration narratives was going to be very important for us. We also found, this also relates to the statistics that's available and the knowledge gap that needs to be addressed, particularly from the different perspective. And I've been asked a lot recently about the contributions of immigrants to the Nigerian economy. Particularly recently, we had the National Migration Dialogue, and it was focused on socioeconomic contributions of migrants, and it was going to move beyond seeing Nigeria as a sending country. That knowledge gap needs to be fixed, but also the idea of having a negative narrative about migration, focusing excessively on irregular migration and what that meant for immobilizing the continent. Because what we were seeing are an association between journeys by road and irregularity and undocumented migrants. So people had seen so many images, and this shows up in my recent research as well, of what was wrong with taking a road journey, and the fact that many times you want to talk about using a particular route, it's always about irregular migrants, that it became of concern whether they should go by road at all. So when we're interviewing people and they said, well, I do want to travel, maybe even to Cote d'Ivoire, but going by road is not an option. So that's that narrowing view of migration came out for us. Again, particularly when it came to income categories, I asked myself at the time, could I have come to this conclusion if I wasn't reflexive? And my answer at the time was no. So we're asking certain questions. The question was addressed to policymakers, but also in this particular instance, I'm comparing the answers of local Nigerians working with immigrant-owned firms and immigrants who set up their own firms or who are working with other immigrant-owned firms. And so the question was a comparative question between their wages. So what did they think about the income differences between themselves as foreigners and Nigerians, and of course to Nigerians themselves as Nigerians compared to foreigners. And people were really not able to look beyond qualification differences as what should account for wage differentials. when they were looking at it from a local perspective. So they'd say, well, I have a master's degree, and this other guy also had a master's degree, and I really can't figure out why he has to be paid 10 times as much as I was. And when we asked the same question from the perspective of the recipient of the higher wage, mostly they say, well, before I make the decision to migrate, I would have to negotiate. Oh, well, I understand that there could be security issues, so I have to negotiate a particular locality where I'm going to live. I have to negotiate a salary that allows me to have a car. So it's not possible for me to work under the same conditions, find my way to work, use the public transport as locals, for example. I have to think about how much I'm going to be paying for schooling and the opportunity cost of moving my family or moving members of my family from where I'm coming from. So there was this idea of real wages, what exactly you could do with your money, and nominal wages, which in economics means the monetary value of what you're receiving. So most of the time, when you talked about wage differentials, people were just comparing $1,000 to $100, and they were not really understanding what it meant in terms of purchasing power parity. But it's not really about purchasing power parity. It's about what a local can access, which markets a local can access, and which ones a foreigner can access. And this applies outside of Nigeria, for example, when we think of tuition fees of foreigners in universities across the globe. It happens when you come to Nigeria, you have to pay a different tuition fee as a foreigner, but it also happens when we go elsewhere. So I'll just conclude by saying that collaborative writing can be really uncomfortable, but it's worth it because of the significant insights we were able to come about. It's important to recognize realities of time and resource constraints when we're doing collaborative writing. And that being an insider is beyond having provincial knowledge. It reflects the epistemological discoveries that can come from the global south, in other words. And that's what this did for us, was to create spaces of inclusion, particularly to providing original results. So I thank you very, very much for your attention, and thank you so much.
Thank you for watching this TESS talk. Please visit our website to learn more about the series and GCSJ. Please subscribe to this channel and follow us on social media to keep up to date on future events. The details of those are in the description. Once again, thank you for watching.